All right, so tonight is a special episode. We'll finish the hunt for mom and dad. We've been building this big picture of the deep history in the human story, and tonight we're going to have a bit of a homecoming and spend time reacquainting ourselves with the Old Testament stories. In episode 4, the gods go silent. All right, so part 1 for tonight is going to be a recap: the Bronze Age collapse, the self, and the fall. And before we start exploring the Bible, I wanted to take a minute to just run through everywhere we've been as we've been building this core thesis of the Life in the Garden series. And I want to start tonight with Princeton professor Julian Jaynes. So Jaynes in the 1970s was asking the question that we've picked up in this series. Essentially, when did self-consciousness emerge in humans? And a lot of what we went through last week is drawn from his research and theories. He went back into ancient times, read the old texts, and took seriously the reports that people left behind about hearing directly from the gods. There are huge numbers of records that we've unearthed reporting the experience of encountering a living divine presence. And Jaynes actually believed that every human being, as a matter of neurology, heard authoritative voices, auditory hallucinations generated by the brain and experienced as gods, ancestors, or dead kings, and that the entire social architecture of the Bronze Age civilizations existed to support and organize this experience. For me, I don't know enough about that, and I haven't really gotten to vet that or explore how that could be. So for me, that is really just an idea still, but even as an idea, I think it's really cool, even if it's fiction. There's something really interesting about it to take these old reports seriously, and that's usually a good sign for me. But I think we can say that from the reports, people experienced communion with the divine, and that was normal in some sense. That was a part of the human nervous system regulating. And Jaynes' big idea was that this whole palace economy system that maintains this mode of being, this mode of attention, completely falls apart in the Bronze Age collapse. And out of that breakdown, across centuries, self-consciousness emerges as an emergency replacement for the voices that had stopped. Jaynes portrayed the Bronze Age collapse as a massive disruption, absolutely massive, which corroborates the way the Western Christian tradition portrays the Garden of Eden as a massive rupture. But I don't think that's the whole story. I do agree that the Bronze Age collapse was super traumatic and potentially defining for Western lineages the more I get to know this event. I speculate whether we're still recovering from the wound of this chaos. But as we saw last week, it's clear that we see the introduction of self-consciousness earlier. And in my view, the introduction of self-consciousness feels more like a stroke of magic, a gift. In the same way that we saw the images were a gift when they emerged tens of thousands of years ago, and language enabled us to connect in a separate world of shared images so that we can meet each other in a powerful new way. The image space transformed life for the humans and led to genuinely incredible acts of creation. The birth of the sacred in the human imagination, and the communion and participation that we see in the records. Just imagine you're in a world and life is secure The earth provides for everyone's needs, and you live in a safe environment that has enough. And you are naked and not ashamed. And somehow, in some form, you walk with God in the cool of the day. And then one thing happens, and everything changes. And the next thing you know, you're on your own. You're in survival mode. You've lost the connection. The communion you had is veiled, and you can't feel it anymore. God is gone. The master who was governing the prosperous domain is gone. The emissary is left alone to manage everything. The open mode of attention is veiled. The connection is frayed. What was able to let in the whole picture is lost, and life becomes small, finite, grasping to survive. And the self-center becomes the way that humans regulate themselves. In the garden, you're regulated by the forest, by the group, in your body. Everything is communal. Everything is provided by the field. You're an expression of it, expressing the glory of creation, even when that's painful. And in the Bronze Age collapse turn, we find scattered people across the whole civilization who now have to deal with managing on their own. Ready to begin. Part 2, Israel is born. So before we dive into the Bible, wanted to do some background on how the nation of Israel comes about. Before Israel exists, there is Canaan, a land of city-states, each with its own temple, its own priests, its own gods, and presiding over all of them is El, head of the Canaanite pantheon, father of the 70 gods. The texts from Ugarit call him Ul El, father of years, the kind one. El is an aged patriarch who sits enthroned at the source of the cosmic rivers, where the two deeps meet, dispensing wisdom, settling disputes among his children, presiding over the divine council the way a clan elder presides over a family that has grown too large to manage. El will later become a generic Hebrew term for God, which you may recognize the word Elohim, but here El is specific, and his name is El. He has a wife, Asherah, the living tree, mother of 70 gods, who are the sons of El, the divine family of Canaan. She is the one who gets things done. When Baal needs a palace, he doesn't ask El. He asks Asherah to ask El, because she is the only one who can move him. She rides her donkey to the source of the rivers, brings the old man a gift, and talks him into it. She is diplomat, intercessor, mother, manager, the goddess you actually need when the household falls apart. And El's champion, Baal, the storm god who brings the rain, who dies every winter and rises every spring. The whole land worships all of them. El is not a distant god. At Ugarit, a city that burned in the Bronze Age collapse, the library preserved a text where El gets drunk at a feast, staggers home, and collapses. The tablet ends with a hangover cure. This is a God who eats and drinks and stumbles, a God who is present the way family is present. When the earliest biblical stories describe God walking in the garden, eating dinner with Abraham, wrestling with Jacob, that's El's fingerprint. The intimate, fatherly, embodied God of the oldest biblical layers is the Canaanite El, absorbed into the tradition. And then there's Baal, young, powerful warrior. He fights the sea chaos, and winds. He brings the rain. In a dry land, he is the God that feeds the land. His worship involves the whole community. Festivals reenacting his death in winter and his resurrection in spring. Every year, the cycle turns. Centuries in the future, Hebrew prophets will rage against Baal worship. But here, while Israel takes shape, Baal is simply the active face of the divine, the God you need on a Tuesday. Now we'll fly south to a different group in the wilderness of Midian, Edom, Seir. We'll leave the cities, the temples, the fields, and go into the desert. Semi-nomadic pastoralists, tent dwellers, moving with their flocks through the wilderness, the dry land south and east of Canaan. No temple, no statue, no institutional mediation, and they worship a God the settled world has never heard of. Yahweh. Their God is Yahweh, and Yahweh is not El. Yahweh is storm. Yahweh is fire, earthquake. The oldest text in the Bible, the Song of Deborah from Judges 5, says, Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled, the heavens poured, the mountains quaked. Yahweh is a God you meet at a mountain that is shaking and burning, a God who appears in fire that doesn't consume, not intimate, not fatherly, terrifying, direct, not something to be carved of stone or housed in a temple building. And when Moses asks this God for a name, Yahweh refuses. I am who I am. Yahweh is alive. Yahweh is a verb, not a noun, not a fixed thing you can understand or define. Nearly every other god in the ancient Near East can be named, imaged, carved, housed, and ultimately managed. Yahweh resists the image space. You cannot make a picture of I am. You cannot pull I will be what I will be on a shelf and tend to it. This God breaks that pattern. And then the Bronze Age collapse. The palace economies that regulated the Canaanite lowlands disintegrate. The coastal cities burn, the trade networks shatter. And these two streams, one tribe from the north and one tribe from the south, El's family and Yahweh's fire, will merge into one tribe right as the Bronze Age collapse is raging. The people who carry the memory of El's intimate fatherhood and the people who carry the experience of Yahweh's burning mountain will become Israel. The name itself, Israel, carries El, not Yahweh. The merger is so complete that the Bible itself preserves both names side by side, sometimes in the same verse. The patriarchs worship El at Canaanite sacred sites. Moses meets Yahweh in the desert. Somehow these two become the same God. In the collapse aftermath, the archaeological record shows a sudden proliferation of small villages in the Canaanite hill country. Roughly 250 hilltop communities that weren't there before. Simple houses, terraced farming, cisterns, herding. And for roughly 240 years, from these settlements to Solomon, Israel has no central temple, no institutional mediation, no king. Worship happens at local sanctuaries, at high places on hilltops, and at household shrines. The ark is portable. The sacred is decentralized. In a world where every other civilization is managing its relationship with God through central temples and statues and professional priests, Israel has none of that. No palace, no temple, no monumental architecture, no writing. And the pottery develops out of Canaanite forms. Step into any one of these houses, look to the niche by the hearth, and Asherah is there. Small clay figurines of a woman, hundreds of them found in almost every excavated Israelite home from this period. And not just in the home. At Kuntilat Adrud, an Israelite way station in the Sinai desert, someone scratched a blessing into the plaster wall. I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. His Asherah, the fierce desert god who refuses to be imaged, has a consort, and she has a sacred pole standing right beside his altar at official worship sites for centuries. The old religion didn't disappear. It didn't even hide. This is what Israelite religion actually looked like for centuries after the collapse. Israel is born from the rubble. All right, and now with a feel for this new people of Israel, we're going to walk through the Bible as the record of the loss of communion, the record of exile. So we're going to read the Bible as documentation of what it feels like to lose communion with God, written by people who were living through that loss in real time across centuries. But first, we need to understand when it was written. I think that most people, myself included, have a vague sense that the Bible was written more or less as events happened. Moses wrote the first 5 books, David wrote the Psalms, Solomon wrote Proverbs, the prophets wrote their prophecies, and it all got collected together into the books that we have now. But it turns out that is not the case at all. The scholarly consensus, built over more than 2 centuries of textual analysis, archaeology, and comparative study, is that the Hebrew Bible was composed, compiled, and edited primarily between the 10th and 5th centuries BCE. Some fragments are older. The Song of Deborah I mentioned earlier is considered the oldest text in the Bible and may be from the 12th or 11th century. But the shaped narratives, the edited histories, the genealogies, the theological arguments we actually read, those are products of a specific period that comes after the Bronze Age collapse. Scholars have identified at least 4 major sources woven into the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And these 4 sources are called the J, E, P, and D sources. And you can see from the chart, they show up all across these 5 books of the Bible. So this is called the documentary hypothesis. And while the details are debated, the broad framework has held up for over a century. J, the J source. It's called J because it uses the name Yahweh for God, and in German, Yahweh starts with a J. J is probably the oldest narrative strand, dated to around the 9th or 10th century BCE. J gives us some of the most vivid, anthropomorphic portraits of God in the entire Bible. God walks in the garden. God smells Noah's sacrifice and is pleased. God sits with Abraham under the oaks of Mamre and eats a meal. This is a God who is present, physically, tangibly present. J may be preserving the memory of a time when that presence was not metaphorical. The E source uses the name Elohim for God. Slightly later than J, probably from the northern kingdom of Israel. In E, God is already more distant. God speaks through dreams and angels rather than showing up in person. The intimacy of J is fading, The signal is getting weaker. The D source, the Deuteronomist. This is where things get really interesting. In 622 BCE, King Josiah of Judah reportedly discovered a scroll in the temple during renovations. This scroll, almost certainly the core of Deuteronomy, became the basis for a massive religious reform. Josiah centralized all worship in Jerusalem, destroyed the local shrines, and established Deuteronomy as authoritative law. Most critical scholars believe Josiah did not find the scroll. He or his scribes wrote it, or more precisely, they composed it and attributed it to Moses to give it authority. And from their point of view, this isn't a scandal. This is how ancient literature worked. You didn't write under your own name. You wrote under the name of the authority whose tradition you were carrying forward. And notably, until Josiah's reform, Asherah is worshipped alongside Yahweh across Israel and Judah. Her figurines are in the homes, her pole is standing in the temple itself, and Josiah tears it all out. And notice what's happening. By Josiah's time, the late 7th century, the relationship to the divine has changed so fundamentally that the people need a written document to tell them what God wants. The presence is no longer felt directly. Communion has been textualized. What was once a living experience has become words on a scroll. The living God has become a book. This is not progress. This is the documentation of a loss. The communion is gone. And finally, the P source, the priestly source, written during or after the Babylonian exile, 6th century BCE. This is the most structured, most ritualistic, most systematic of the sources. P actually gives us the creation account in Genesis 1. And God said, "Let there be light." It gives us the elaborate Levitical laws, the tabernacle specifications, the priestly rituals. P is the sound of a religious establishment trying to systematize the relationship to God that can no longer be experienced directly. If you can't feel God's presence, you can at least follow the procedures correctly. The ritual replaces the intimacy. So what we have in the first 5 books of the Bible is not a single document written by Moses. It's a layered text composed over roughly 400 years in which you can hear the progressive loss of divine presence like a signal fading. J, God walks with us. He's right here. We can see him, hear him, eat with him. E, God speaks through intermediaries now, dreams, angels. The direct encounter is becoming rare. D, God has given us a book. The instructions are written down because we can no longer hear them spoken. P, God has given us a system. Follow the rituals precisely, and perhaps the connection can be maintained through procedure. That's not 4 different theologies. That's 4 snapshots of the same civilization losing contact and trying at each stage to hold on to whatever thread remains. Now let's get into some specific stories, because once we see the Bible as a record of the gradual loss of communion, like a fading signal, the individual narratives light up in ways that the traditional readings completely miss. Genesis 1 through 3. We've covered this, but let me add a new twist. These are 2 different creation accounts. Genesis 1, the P source, is structured, orderly, cosmic. God speaks the world into existence from a distance. Let there be light. This is the God of the priestly mind, transcendent, systematic, powerful, but remote. Genesis 2 and 3, the J source, is intimate, earthy, close. God forms Adam from dust. He breathes into his nostrils. He plants a garden and puts the man in it. He brings the animals to Adam to see what he'll name them. And the text says this as if God is genuinely curious. This is a God who is present in a way that the P source can't imagine anymore. And then the fall, which we've covered in detail. Notice the J source, the older source, is the one that preserves the memory of direct communion and the story of its loss. The people who wrote J were closer to the pre-self-conscious mode of being. They still had some cultural memory of what it was like when God walked in the garden and the master was leading. By the time the P source writes Genesis 1, that embodied memory has been replaced by theology. All right, moving on. Genesis 4, the very next story after the garden, Cain and Abel. Cain is a farmer, Abel is a shepherd. Both bring offerings to God. God regards Abel's offering. He does not regard Cain's. This is remarkable. We are only one story outside the garden, and already an offering does not successfully reach God. The channel that was open in the garden, where God walked and talked and ate with his people, is not fully open anymore. Something has changed. The signal is fading. And here's what's extraordinary. God speaks to Cain directly, face to face. Why are you angry? If you do well, will you not be accepted? Sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. This is still the J source. This is still the God who shows up in person. The channel is live. God is right there, coaching him, just like in the garden. And Cain can't hear it. Cain has an image in his mind. I brought an offering. The offering is supposed to work. I did the right thing. The result is supposed to follow. And when the result doesn't come, the image shatters, and everything that follows is the shrapnel. He's not listening to what God is actually saying. The rejection of the offering has become a rejection of him. God is standing right in front of him, telling him the door is open, and Cain cannot receive it. Not because God left, not because the channel broke, because something inside Cain, the self that keeps score, the self that expects a return on investment, has made him deaf to the voice that is speaking directly into his ear. This is the fall, not that God actually left, but because we have become unable to notice God even when he's standing right in front of us. Cain kills his brother. He goes to the land of Nod, which means wandering, and he builds the first city. His line invents metalworking, musical instruments, agriculture at scale. The entire apparatus of civilization descends from the brother who couldn't hear God's voice. And Seth is born, a replacement for Abel. And the text says, at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. Prayer begins because communion ended. Religion as a practice is born from the murder of the one who didn't need it. Noah. The text says in Genesis 6, Noah walked with God. That phrase, the same language used for Adam and Eve in the garden, walking with God. Noah is one of the last humans for whom the channel is fully open. Noah hears God directly, specific instructions. Build an ark, these dimensions, these materials, take these animals. Noah receives and acts. No deliberation, no questioning, no negotiation. The divine voice is clear, authoritative, and immediately obeyed. He's like Gudea, who we looked at last week, the Sumerian king who sleeps in the temple and wakes up with a blueprint. Same world, the God speaks and the human builds. And then after the flood passes, Noah offers a sacrifice, and God smells the pleasing aroma. That's the J source, the oldest source. Present, earthy, embodied, the God who walks in the garden and eats with Abraham. Still here, still close enough to smell the smoke. But then P, the priestly source, which comes centuries later, gives us what comes next in the story. God makes a covenant, a contract, the rainbow as a sign. I will never again destroy the earth. In the garden, you don't need a covenant. You're with the person. Covenants are what you make when you can no longer be sure the other party won't leave. Two sources, two gods, same story, with the signal fading between the tellings. And one final story, the golden calf. So Moses goes up into the mountain, 40 long days. The people wait and wait. The voice of God, the one they heard at Sinai, the one that shook the ground, is gone. Moses is gone. They're standing in the desert with absolutely nothing. So they do what any people in the ancient world would have done. They go to Aaron and say, make us a God we can see. Make us something to follow. They're not being wicked. They're being human. The divine presence has vanished, and they are reaching for the only technology they know to get it back. Aaron collects their gold earrings. He melts them down and casts a calf, a young bull. The bull is El's animal. This is Canaanite iconography. This is what they grew up with. And Aaron says, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. He is not introducing a foreign deity. He's trying to give Yahweh a visible form. He builds an altar in front of it and declares a festival to the Lord, to Yahweh. He's activating a cult image the way any Bronze Age priest would. He doesn't think he's doing anything wrong. And it doesn't work. The people offer sacrifices, they eat, they drink, they dance. Everything looks like worship and communion. But God isn't accessible through the calf anymore. The statue sits there, golden, beautiful, empty. The old technology that once housed the gods has produced a festival, but not a presence, just gold. The conditions have changed. The problem isn't that statues are sinful. The problem is that the self now stands between the person and the image, preventing the communion from flowing. The golden calf is the right tool for a world that no longer exists.